When Edward VI breathed his last hoarse breath on July 6, 1553, his death was kept in strictest secrecy for 2 days. These days were a time of feverish preparation as Northumberland consolidated his position, and the inevitability of her fate loomed over Jane Grey. One July morning, as the sun was just beginning to pierce through the London haze, Northumberland and several other members of the Privy Council appeared before Jane at the Duke of Suffolk's house. The air in the room was thick, charged with the premonition of something monumental. Jane, clad in a simple dress, sat at a table, engrossed in reading. Her heart, usually calm, suddenly beat faster, sensing that something was amiss. When she was informed of King Edward's death and the will was read, naming her as his successor, the pallor of death descended upon her face. The air was knocked out of her lungs. Jane did not weep, nor did she scream, but her eyes, usually filled with the calm light of reason, widened in terror. Her hands trembled, the book falling from her weakened fingers. She, a scholar and theologian, a queen? It was unthinkable, monstrous. She fell to her knees, tears finally bursting forth, streaming down her cheeks like spring rivulets. She prayed, not for power, but for the Lord to deliver her from this heavy burden, this unwelcome crown imposed upon her by avaricious hands. "I am not capable of such a great burden," she whispered through her tears. "I am not a queen." But her pleas were drowned out by Northumberland's cold resolve and the hypocritical assurances of her own parents, the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, who saw in their daughter's ascent only a path to their own advancement. They needed her hands to seize power, her innocence to mask their ambitions. Thus, under pressure, frightened and broken, Jane Grey was forced to accept the fate prepared for her. The crown, which should have been a symbol of divine grace, felt like a leaden weight upon her head. The Tower of London, not merely a fortress, not merely a palace, but a symbol. The cradle and grave of the English monarchy, keeper of secrets, witness to centuries of blood and betrayal. At noon, on July 10, 1553, the young Jane Grey, now called Queen of England, entered these ancient gates. She entered not with triumph, not to the jubilant cries of the crowd, but with a heavy heart and the feeling of a fateful procession. The procession was modest, almost ominous. Northumberland's close associates, their faces tense and serious. Behind them, bodyguards, and then the unfortunate Jane, her husband Guildford, and his mother, the Duchess of Northumberland. Her heart tightened with foreboding as she passed under Traitor's Gate, though she did not yet grasp the full irony of the name. She did not know that the Tower would become for her both a throne and a prison, and a place of final rest. Her 9-day tenure on the throne began. 9 days that entered history as one of the shortest and most tragic chapters in the annals of English monarchs. These days were filled not with the joys of power, but with an agonizing struggle. Jane discovered that her role was not queen, but pawn. Northumberland tried to rule in her name, using her as a puppet. But Jane, despite her youth and apparent fragility, possessed an unyielding spirit. She flatly refused to make her husband Guildford king consort, declaring that only Parliament had the right to bestow that title. "The crown of England is not a gift that can be passed on at whim," she uttered with unexpected firmness, astounding Guildford and his ambitious mother. This was one of the few acts of defiance she was able to show. And outside the Tower in summer England, a fire was igniting. News of Edward's death and Jane's proclamation spread across the country like a wildfire carried by the wind. But not everyone accepted this coup. In the rural counties, especially in Catholic strongholds, discontent grew. The true heir, Mary, did not sit idly by. With an unyielding will inherited from her mother, Catherine of Aragon, she issued a call to her supporters. She declared herself the legitimate queen and raised the banner of her claim to the throne. From the depths of the countryside where she had been in hiding, Mary addressed the people. Her message was simple and powerful. She was the legitimate daughter of Henry VIII, the rightful heir, and her rights had been trampled upon. Catholic England, exhausted by religious reforms and instability, saw in her a savior, a symbol of a return to the old order, to the familiar faith. Knights and yeomen, peasants and priests, all who were weary of uncertainty and change, flocked to her banner. Mary proved to be a charismatic leader capable of inspiring the people. Northumberland, realizing the gravity of the threat, was forced to leave London and personally lead an army against Mary. His departure from the capital proved to be a fatal mistake. He left Jane alone, surrounded by only a few supporters in the Tower, like a bird in a gilded cage. The Duke's campaign was accompanied by ominous portents. The sky was scowling, the fields were gripped by drought, and the people, instead of joining Northumberland's army, either hid or openly defected to Mary's side. The morale of his troops was broken. Desertion became widespread, and his commanders, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to switch sides one by one. Left in the Tower, Jane felt the ground slipping from beneath her feet. Every hour brought new, increasingly alarming news. Whispers of fear swept through the corridors of the Tower. Her supporters, her privy council, began to waver and then openly defected to Mary's side. During these days, Jane remained in her royal apartments, which would soon turn into a prison cell, reading, praying, trying to find solace in faith. She felt alone, abandoned in a whirlpool of others' ambitions. On the evening of July 19, 1553, as a cold night, thickened by August dampness, had already descended upon the Tower, the inevitable occurred. Within the fortress walls, where only 9 days earlier she had been proclaimed queen, the Privy Council reconvened, but this time their voices were filled with jubilation, the jubilation of victors who had quickly changed allegiance. They proclaimed Mary the rightful Queen of England. Joyful shouts echoed in the air. The bells of London's churches, long silent, began to peal, deafening everything around, announcing Mary's victory. These sounds reached Jane like peals of thunder, presaging a storm. She sat alone, engrossed in prayer, when a knock at her door broke the silence. The Earl of Arundel entered, one of those who had sworn allegiance to her only recently. His face was pale, but resolute. His words were spoken respectfully, but their meaning was like a dagger thrust. "Your Majesty, you are no longer queen." He informed her that Queen Mary had been recognized, and she, Jane, was now arrested for high treason. Her world collapsed. 9 days, that was all her reign lasted. 9 days that forever changed her life, turning her from a scholarly girl who dreamed only of tranquility into a hostage of cruel political games. She listened to Arundel, her face devoid of all expression, only her eyes betraying the inner turmoil. She accepted her fate with dignity, with the same fatalistic resignation with which she had accepted the crown. On the same day, her husband Guilford, his brother, and his mother, the Duchess of Northumberland, were also arrested. The Tower, which was supposed to be her palace, had definitively become a prison. The Tower, this ancient stone monster, had been Jane's home throughout those fateful days, but now its walls took on a different meaning. From the royal apartments, she was transferred to the less spacious, damp rooms of the Ladies' Tower, located in the eastern part of the fortress, not far from Beauchamp Tower. The creak of the door closing behind her severed her from the world. The The cold, damp air, saturated with the smell of lime and old stones, was her new constant companion. The windows, high set and barred with thick grills, allowed in only meager light that could not dispel the gloom within. Days and weeks dragged on agonizingly slowly. Jane spent her time in prayer and reading, finding solace in biblical texts. She wrote letters full of bitterness and resignation, understanding that her fate hung by a thread. In late November 1553, she appeared before the court at Guildhall. The charge was simple and irrefutable: high treason. She admitted that she had signed documents proclaiming her queen, but insisted that she had acted under duress and without malicious intent. Her lawyers, if indeed she had any, proved powerless against the might of Queen Mary. The verdict was predictable: death penalty. Jane listened to it with the same detachment with which she had accepted the crown and her arrest. She knew that her life was merely a pawn in a political game. Mary seemed to hesitate. Perhaps deep down she felt pity for this young, scholarly girl who had merely been a tool in others' hands. She did not want to begin her reign with an execution, especially when it concerned her own kinswoman. Jane could only be dangerous as a symbol, a banner under which the discontented might unite. But Mary hoped that depriving Jane of her freedom would be sufficient. However, fate intervened once more in the cruelest manner. In January 1554, Wyatt's rebellion erupted. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, a Protestant, raised a rebellion in Kent, protesting against Mary's marriage to the Spanish Prince Philip and, more dangerously, against the return to Catholicism. The rebels, though they did not openly proclaim Jane Grey their queen, saw in her a potential leader of the Protestant opposition. For Mary, this was the final straw. Jane Grey, alive and in the Tower, was too dangerous. Her very existence provoked unrest. The verdict was rendered: Jane must die. Before her execution, in the last days of her life, John Feckenham, Abbot of Westminster, came to Jane, sent by Mary to persuade her to renounce Protestantism and embrace the Catholic faith. Feckenham, a pious and learned man, sincerely hoped to save her soul and perhaps her life. He had several long, intense conversations with Jane. In these conversations, Jane displayed not only her erudition and deep theological knowledge, but also an unwavering faith. She calmly but firmly refuted his arguments, basing them on the Holy Scriptures, refusing to accept the dogmas of the Catholic Church. Her mind was sharp and her spirit unyielding. She remained true to her convictions until the end. Feckenham, struck by her steadfastness and erudition, was forced to admit his defeat. He left her filled with admiration and sorrow. On the eve of her death, Jane wrote a farewell letter to her younger sister, Lady Catherine Grey. Her handwriting, usually calligraphically clear, was now slightly uneven, but the words were full of dignity and stoicism. "Do not forsake Christ, for the world loves him not. Be faithful to your faith, and he will reward you." This was not merely a farewell, it was a testament, an admonition to live righteously in a world full of temptations and injustice. The night of February 11th, 12th, 1554 was long and cold. Within the stone walls of the Tower, an ominous silence reigned, broken only by the rare footsteps of guards and the distant howl of the wind. Jane spent it in prayer, her small, fragile figure appearing even smaller in the vast stone room. She prepared to meet God, her soul serene, though her human body, of course, trembled before the unknown. The morning of February 12, 1554, greeted London with a leaden sky and a bone-chilling wind that drove gray, surging waves along the Thames. A raw cold hung in the air, mingled with the scent of damp earth and unspoken fear. Through the dim light of dawn, only a hint of the sun pierced, as if the world wished not to witness what was about to unfold. Inside the tower, in the rooms designated for prisoners, a personal drama unfolded. Lady Jane Grey, dressed in a simple yet clean white gown, a symbol of purity and innocence, stood, pale but remarkably serene. Her delicate hands held a small prayer book, and her gaze, usually contemplative, was now fixed somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond life. Yesterday she wrote her last letter to her sister. Today the scaffold awaited her. Her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, was to be executed first. He was led to Tower Hill outside the fortress, where crowds had gathered to feast on the spectacle. Jane in her cell could not see the execution itself, but she heard the muffled cries of the crowd, which, rising and falling, reached her through the thick walls. And then, some time later, as she was being led to the tower's inner courtyard, where her own scaffold had been erected, she saw a cart. The cart, drawn by horses, was returning from Tower Hill. In it lay Guildford's lifeless body, his head covered by a cloth, but blood had seeped through, staining the canvas darkly. Jane stopped, her eyes, tearless, fixed upon the body. She did not cry out, did not sob, only a faint sigh escaped her chest like a gust of wind. This was her husband, her unloved but now dead husband. She knew that his ambitions, his father's schemes, their shared marriage, all had led him to this end. She simply stood and watched as the cart passed by, disappearing around the bend. This sight, horrifying in its callousness, did not break her. It only strengthened her resolve to meet her fate with dignity. Finally, she was led to the inner courtyard. Here, unlike Tower Hill, only a limited number of spectators were present, members of the Privy Council, some noblemen, soldiers, and a few clergymen. Queen Mary preferred Jane's execution to be devoid of public character, to avoid creating a martyr in the eyes of Protestants. The air here was even colder, rawer, the crunch of soles on stone, rare stifled coughs, whispers, all created an ominous score for her final journey. The scaffold, a crude wooden structure rising in the center of the courtyard. 2 steps led up to the platform, covered with fresh straw. On this straw, like an ominous idol, lay a low, thick block of wood, the chopping block. Beside it, an axe gleaming in the dull light, its blade sharpened to a razor's edge. The air around the scaffold seemed especially heavy, thick with anticipation. Jane ascended the scaffold, her steps firm, though she was so small that the steps seemed too high for her. On her face, though pale, there was no trace of fear, only deep concentration. She surveyed those present, her eyes gliding over faces that showed curiosity, pity, and even some malice. Then she spoke. Her voice, soft but distinct, carried across the courtyard, drowning out the wind and the rustling of branches. She delivered no angry speeches, cursed no enemies. She spoke of her guilt, of having accepted a crown that did not belong to her, but insisted that it was done against her will and without malicious intent. "I acknowledge that I deserve death," she said, "for a transgression against Her Majesty the Queen." She spoke of her faith, of her Protestantism, which was the only truth for her. She forgave all who had brought her to this end, and prayed for their souls. "I stand here today to die," she uttered, her voice unwavering, "for breaking the Queen's laws, which I had no right to do.
and yet I maintained that I had neither intention nor desire to do this, but was persuaded. I was innocent of intent." Then she asked all present to pray for her, and, raising her prayer book, uttered, "I hope through God's grace to be in everlasting rest." After these words, the executioner approached her, a man in dark clothes, his face hidden by a hood. His presence, almost silent, was the embodiment of relentless death. He knelt before Jane, asking for her forgiveness. She nodded to him, quietly replying, "From my heart." Then, with the help of her maid, who accompanied her to the last moment, Jane removed her headpiece and unbound her hair, allowing it to fall freely upon her shoulders. She handed her maid her handkerchief and gloves. The moment had come. The executioner pointed to the chopping block. Jane knelt down. She felt the roughness of the straw beneath her knees. Then she asked the executioner to do his work swiftly and cleanly. "I hope you will not cause me too much pain," she said, her words almost a whisper. The executioner took a silk handkerchief to blindfold her. Jane handed it to him herself. As darkness enveloped her, she suddenly felt a slight tremor. And in that moment, in that complete darkness, she lost her bearings. She stretched out her hands, her voice, for the first time that morning, tinged with despair. "Where is the block? Where is it?" Someone standing nearby helped her, perhaps Feckenham or one of the officers, gently guiding her hands to the wood. Her fingers touched the cold, smooth surface. She lowered her head, resting it on the block. And then, in that ringing silence, her last, loud, distinct cry resounded. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." A heavy pause hung over the tower courtyard, as if the world stood still, awaiting the inevitable. Then came a whistle, cutting through the air, the sound of a heavy, sharpened axe being swung. A moment later, a dull, wet thud, and then another, more gruesome sound, the thud of a severed head falling onto the straw. The crowd gathered in the courtyard shuddered. A stifled gasp was heard. Then, complete, absolute silence. The executioner, his figure seeming even more ominous, lifted the bloody head by its hair. Her eyes were open, her face pale but bearing an expression of astonishing serenity. He displayed the head to those gathered, as was customary, demonstrating the execution of the sentence. Blood, warm and steaming in the cold air, soaked the straw. The smell of iron and death filled the courtyard. Jane Grey's body, now merely a lifeless shell, remained lying on the scaffold. It was soon carried away. The entire procedure was swift, brutal, merciless. Another life taken by the wheel of history, another victim of political ambitions and religious strife. After the execution of Lady Jane Grey, her headless body was carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located within the tower. There, alongside the remains of her husband Guildford, as well as notable tower victims like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, queens of Henry VIII, she was interred without pomp or ceremony, without the marks of distinction that would be accorded even a common nobleman. Just a stone on the floor, nameless, dateless, merely the gloom and silence of eternal shadows consuming the stories of all who ended their days within those walls. Her blood, absorbed by the straw of the scaffold, remained a mute testament to this tragedy, washed away only by rain and time. The execution of Jane Grey became a decisive moment in the consolidation of Mary I's power. It eliminated the most obvious threat to her reign, showing the world that she would tolerate no challenges to her throne. Her resolve, displayed at this moment, foreshadowed the subsequent years of her reign, marked by an unrelenting and at times cruel determination to restore Catholicism in England. Jane's spilled blood, however, was not forgotten. It only solidified in the minds of many Protestants the image of a young martyr who died for her faith. Her story became a somber warning of how dangerous it was in those tumultuous times to stand in the way of a powerful crown. The echo of this tragedy resounded through the centuries, filling the pages of history textbooks and literary works. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, remained in the memory of descendants not as a sovereign, but as a victim, a symbol of innocently suffering youth, of spiritual strength in the face of inevitable death, and the terrible price that sometimes must be paid for others' ambitions. Her image, fragile and intellectual, yet possessing an iron will in matters of faith, was forever etched in history as one of the most poignant. She was not born for the crown, but the crown was imposed upon her, becoming for her not a symbol of power, but the executioner's iron hoop. The Tower, this silent witness, continues to stand, its ancient stones holding thousands of stories of hope, despair, betrayal, and death. And among them, alongside formidable monarchs and powerful lords, forever remains the story of a young girl whose name, Lady Jane Grey, is still whispered by the wind in its cold corridors, a reminder of the cruelty of the past and the fragility of human life in the face of inexorable fate. Her story is not just a collection of facts, it is a living, bleeding reminder of how easily a bright mind and a pure soul can be crushed in the millstones of high politics, leaving behind only the echo of unspoken words and unfulfilled hopes.